Okay, so essentially these are community update videos. I was thinking to do them maybe like once per quarter. Essentially my idea or my goal with them is to just get myself comfortable like talking on camera more often. I'm supposed to hear. Get myself more comfortable talking on camera, and especially about my ideas.
It's time to cosplay as a person who has their shit together.
Is Better to Speak is relaunching for the year, and this time I think with a much different I'm gonna say approach, but like a different iteration of Better to Speak than I think has existed before. So essentially what Better to Speak is a community media platform that works with young Black folks to transform silence into language and action, in the words of Audre Lorde. So essentially that means just a Black youth ran and led community media platform and programming, essentially about issues that impact our communities. I started it in 2017. That's when the idea of Better to Speak came, to do a book drive, essentially to collect books by, for, and about Black folks, for Black youth, to provide more positive representation for Black youth. And so the idea I got for it in 2017, but then the first actual program was in 2018. So since then, I have done different projects underneath this brand of Better to Speak, of storytelling for social change, of Black representation in media, essentially different community dialogue events. Of course, Your Sounds Not Protect You being the most recent project that we did, the podcast. Trying to think what else I've done freelancing projects, so I've worked with different Black community leaders and organizations, essentially on their social media websites, other content and things like that. So essentially with all of that experience over the past 2017, so 5 years now, I think this year I'm approaching it differently in terms of like, this is the first time I'm looking at it more holistically in terms of Better to Speak being like a fuller organization. And so kind of looking at all these projects that I've done, and essentially now looking and thinking of those things as like piloting, not the low battery thing, okay, but essentially piloting different programs and different offerings, again under this idea of storytelling for social change. Now I'm thinking of it and looking at it and approaching it more holistically in terms of what does that mean to do them all at once, which sounds overwhelming, but I think kind of offering not just a brand of different projects, but like an organization that has all these different offerings. So essentially kind of falls under what I call 3 different operating pillars. So content, community engagement, and community communications, with content and community engagement. I'm making a pizza, okay. With content and community engagement being the kind of main things. And then the business model for Better to Speak, I'm thinking, is service subsidization. So that means that communications would essentially, the money that Better to Speak makes from that would essentially go towards programming. Because I don't necessarily want to, or as I've like researched, what does that mean for BTS to possibly be a nonprofit? What does that mean for BTS to be like a social enterprise? So not with its goal not necessarily being profit, but not being a nonprofit, if that makes sense. So essentially by offering services through comms, that would allow me to feed that money into programming and not have to rely as much on donations, which I think, like, I don't know. I don't know if it's just me and I don't like ask people for money, but like, I think that has made more sense for me in terms of thinking about different ways that I could not only bring money into Better to Speak, but just kind of interact with like different partners and organizations and my peers. Maybe not just doing an event, maybe not just having a partnership or collaboration on a piece of content, but like also kind of offering like the skills that I have gained in communications and marketing and things like that, to different people's organizations and projects and brands. So I'm gonna go put my piece in the oven. I'll be back.
A few minutes later.
Okay, so essentially I just talked about what Better to Speak is, and as far as with this new iteration or new iteration of Better to Speak, my goals coming into this year. Of course, as I've shared on social media and like elsewhere, with this grant that I received from Press On, that specifically is to go towards helping me do editorial content with Better to Speak. So one of my goals with that was to just work with writers to essentially like run a media platform. So in the process, what I'm in the process of right now is kind of reviewing submissions and pitches that have come in, which have been really dope to see. It's been exciting to kind of like see this thing that I've wanted to do for such a long time kind of come to fruition. So essentially wanting this to be like an actual media platform that produces content that includes the voices of people that just aren't just me. I think, and I'll get to this later, but I think the biggest thing with BTS is just kind of expanding like the reach of it, and not, again, like just not having it be just my voice, but also including the voices and stories of other people, and other Black youth who are doing really dope work. So one form of that is coming through editorial content, people submitting personal essays, like journalistic reporting, other kinds of like social commentary and things like that. Let's see. And of course the podcast will be coming back this year. So this is also a campaign that we're doing, which I'll touch on later, but the theme of the podcast this season is the state of the young Black advocate. So as y'all saw with the first episode, Kési's story, essentially I wanted to focus more on the stories of individual people. I think the way that I approached the podcast in the past was looking at it from different topics and issues and kind of bringing people who represented those topics by way of their work, by way of their personal story. But this season I'm hoping to kind of shift the lens more towards the individual story, and then kind of diving on like how does their individual story reflect the work. So just kind of tipping that scale a little bit. And then also with that, I think with the podcast, one thing that I realized in terms of creating the content, and this goes for editorial content as well, I think that, and I touched on this in my podcast episode, just as far as how burnt out I was feeling from Better to Speak, in terms of it being just me, and in terms of me having all these ideas and all these different offerings and programs and projects that I wanted to do underneath Better to Speak, but again, like only being one person. One thing that I'm approaching differently just in terms of creating content is just like making it a more collaborative process, making it a slower process of really saying like, how do I feel, how do other people who are working on this feel in the midst of doing the work, and not just churning out a bunch of content. Because I feel like, and this is a whole different conversation, but just the state of like content creation nowadays is just constant churning out of content all the time. And so I'm like, even in the pitches that I received, even in the way that I've like started reaching out to people to be on the podcast, I think I'm like having to slow myself down in terms of, okay, like the point of this is to build relationships in the long term, not just thinking about like a piece of content, but one, to build relationships with the people that I'm working with, to kind of be really intentional about like the narrative arc and the journey that these pieces of content are like creating for people that interact with Better to Speak's content. So I think it's just it's been a very different but like more interesting approach to content in the way that I've done it the past couple of years. But I think I'm excited to, again, really just be more intentional about it and like focus more on the relationship and community building aspect of it, and not necessarily just like, oh, my goal is to get this piece of content done, and not, okay, well, I'm interviewing this person for the podcast or for a piece of content, but like really I'm thinking about like community building and that work more long term. And I think also with content, as I'm looking back at my notes, I think another goal that I have is to really have like what I mentioned about narrative arc, and not just putting out all of these different pieces of content that kind of flow under like hot topics and whatever's just popular on social media at whatever given point, but like really, again, thinking about that journey that all of these pieces of content are in conversation with. And it's been really dope to kind of see, like, as submissions and pitches have come in, like people who are pitching ideas and like pitching stories that kind of align with what I'm thinking, but then also like have their own perspective or their own take or angle about it that isn't like, honestly, like a bunch of like me's who are giving me content, but people who are kind of aligned in the same sense of like what issues are important or what approach to certain issues to take. And then secondly, my goal, I think with that, in terms of content, kind of touches on the second goal, is essentially building narrative power among Black youth and young adults. So I think it sounds kind of similar in terms of like, Kési, the narrative is story, narrative is content, but narrative power is essentially, let me look up the definition of it so I don't mess it up. So narrative power is defined as the power to dictate norms and values in society. This includes the ability to shape what's possible and determine what's politically realistic, and even to stretch beyond the possible and establish what is inevitable. So I think my goal is to really, I don't want to say redefine, because I almost approach this narrative change, but I think that I don't want to go into it assuming that the narrative is one thing. So I think that my goal is to really, by way of content, by way of community engagement, specifically with Black youth and young adults, is to look at, analyze, get a better understanding of like, how does society see Black youth? How do Black youth see Black youth? How do we see each other? How do we see ourselves collectively and individually? I think that contextually, being 3 years into the pandemic, I can speak for myself and say that, you know, coming out of school and starting my first full-time job, being 3 years into a pandemic, seeing everything that happened in 2020 with regards to like racial injustice, and seeing like what's the progress from then till now, a year into the Biden administration, like what has changed, what hasn't, like how have the issues that Black youth are experiencing and that we wanted to see front and center, like how are those things being addressed, again, from like our own individual lives all the way up until like national policy, or like even larger, like national culture, global culture. So that sounds like a lot, but I think with what I can do, I think again through content, specifically through a campaign that I'm trying to do, the State of the Young Black Advocate, I really want to do a study, so like a survey of Black youth about our own experiences. So that's narrative research, to kind of put together not only like tangible data, but then also kind of do what we did with the Your Sounds Will Not Protect You zine, but then also like have more of that narrative, personal storytelling. So that's a project that I'm hoping to have done by the end of the year. And then throughout that process, I really want to do events and different programs and stuff like that that really hold space for us to just be in community and like share our own stories, hear other people's stories, so we can all just kind of like build relationships and community and get a better understanding of where we all are. And I think like just from what I have seen from other people just on social media, and again like from my own experience, like being in this phase of life like is a weird transition, again out of school. Like a lot of us have gone through very drastic life changes just by way of age, let alone because of the pandemic. And so I think that's also like one thing that I'm hoping to explore is like just on a very like personal level, but then also of course just like collectively speaking, politically speaking, socially speaking as well. And the third goal I think is less of, I don't want to say less of a goal, it still is a goal, but it's less of like a forward-ish facing goal, if that makes sense, but just really building like Better to Speak's internal capacity. I recently put out I don't want to call it a job, because like the idea of hiring someone makes me uncomfortable. So I put out a listing for someone to come on as content community manager, essentially just to help me with like the day-to-day managing of, like I'm saying, these very big picture ideas, a lot of the day-to-day interactions and correspondence with partners and writers, and I hope you don't see my no, that's embarrassing, but just like the day-to-day kind of weeds of everything, because as I'm thinking about it, like essentially this person's role is like the more technical aspect of mine, as I am trying to make more room for myself to think about those big picture ideas and the big picture relationships, and being able to like understand how to position Better to Speak in all of this and how to make those decisions. I don't want to, because the way that my title is set up, it's head of storytelling and strategy. because the idea of being like CEO or executive director, like that's a lot. So head of I gave myself head of storytelling and strategy. So essentially, like I said, looking at the big picture storytelling of content, looking at the big picture narrative arc of even programming, and thinking of events through a lens of storytelling and a lens of narrative. So essentially, the content community manager would help to manage like the more technical day-to-day aspect of those things in a way that I don't necessarily have but just like the mental space to. And also in a way that just doesn't necessarily like come naturally to me. I think that I've had to obviously do that because Better to Speak is my thing and has been my project and my baby essentially. But I'm trying to work on opening up room for other people to step in and like help me and then make it better. So yeah, I think that covers essentially like all of my goals. I think with that also, or with internal capacity also, thinking about Better to Speak's legal structure. So a lot of people have asked me about that, and I think especially like as I'm working with partners or seeking funding, things like that. So Better to Speak is not a nonprofit, it's not a 501c3, and I'm also not seeking 501c3 status. I think that sometimes I feel or have felt like I had to say that I was seeking 501c3 status, but there's a reason for that. I think that as I've learned more about what nonprofits are and what purpose they serve, I think to back up a little bit, like I started Better to Speak when I was 19 years old, and then I filed for the LLC when I was 20. And I think, again, like I was saying, as I've learned more about like legally and like logistically what it would take to file for a 501c3, like yeah, 50, yeah, something like that. What it would mean to legally and financially file to be a registered nonprofit. Like I just did not have the money for that. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's like what I've heard is like around $500. That's what I've heard. That's a lot. I did not have that at 19 or 20 years old, so I went with an LLC, which is significantly less money. And I think it also gave me room to, again, what I was talking about earlier, think about Better to Speak in terms of projects underneath the brand. And so like I did offer services. I have sold like merch, so products. I have sold Even Your Sounds Not Protect You, the physical copies. It gave me room to think about what exactly I wanted Better to Speak to be without having to necessarily like answer to a board or answer to, you know what I mean, just like the legal structure of that. And I think also the purpose that BTS has served for me personally has been more agency and autonomy, and just being able to do whatever projects I wanted to do underneath, again, that brand. And I'm not sure if this is just because of my own limited understanding of nonprofit status, but I just, from what I understood about them, it just always felt like, oh, this is going to introduce more like rigidity and like going to take away my freedom and agency in a way that I don't necessarily need or care to like maintain or manage. So I don't say that to say like, obviously, and some partners have told me this as far as like, again, seeking funding, where it does make that really hard to give funding because a lot of grants go to registered 501c3s, or if you are fiscally sponsored, there's a lot of things that come with that as well. But really what I have come to, it's also not like a thing that I haven't thought about. I've thought about it for the past 2 or 3 years. I really want Better to Speak to be a cooperative. So essentially, like, I think that's also another goal. So with all these programs and things like that, I want to make Better to Speak into more of a membership-based organization. And so essentially with the co-op, members would be able to partially own Better to Speak as well. And so I think that one would make it so that I have, in terms of accountability, I don't necessarily want to have to be accountable to a board or donors. I think specifically like donors or people with money, just to keep Better to Speak running. Again, what I was mentioning about service subsidization and the reason why I want to offer services and have that be a core aspect of Better to Speak. Like, it is a lot, but it also kind of frees up that space of I don't have to rely solely on donations. And I think sometimes people kind of, I don't want to say box you in, but just like, oh, you're doing something that's like socially good, so that's automatically a nonprofit, when really it's like, no. I think especially as a Black woman who's trying to usher my ideas into the world for social good, like I can still not to say that the purpose of it is making money, but I think there are other avenues to that don't involve or don't have to involve me giving up just like agency over my vision or agency over creatively even. I think just even like the idea of losing autonomy and freedom over my vision is one thing that kind of like scares me with regards to nonprofits or just in general really. But I think that cooperative status is one thing that I think it doesn't scare me as much. I think it opens up more space again, like I was saying, even with bringing people on team wise, just like makes more room for people to add to Better to Speak and even be challenged or held accountable in like those ways, and it'd be more of a collaborative process as opposed to one that kind of maintains really like rigid or outdated like power dynamics, especially when it comes to money, that I don't necessarily care to participate in, or I don't really care to put myself in that position. So that's that. So one thing with that, what I'm exploring this year is what does that mean to become a co-op in terms of legal formation. So I technically could keep BTS as an LLC and then become a cooperative status or become a co-op. I would just have to change like the operating agreements. But then also like, what does that mean? I think you can also become incorporated. There's other legal structures underneath cooperative status you can do as well. So that's all that I'm exploring this year. Like I said, I'm not really in a rush to do it. I think that it's, Better to Speak has really been like a huge experiment for me to just see like what could be possible with it. Like I'm not super tied to like, oh, I'm starting a nonprofit, this is what it's gonna look like. Try not the camera cut off. I was talking for 20 minutes and I thought it didn't save. I was about to throw up. What was I talking about? But yeah, this year I'm wanting to, my goal is really to reach out to different media cooperatives specifically, because I think sometimes even, again, I think I'll reach out to people with one specific kind of project in mind. And what happens often is like people only think of BTS as like a media thing or like a community advocacy thing, but there's a very specific like organization that I'm trying to create or specific platform that I'm trying to create that is very much both media and community engagement. And so I think I really want to reach out to different media cooperatives to learn about like what does that mean to be a media organization that is not necessarily a nonprofit, but that is a cooperative kind of structure. So again, I'm not in a rush really to do that, but I've kind of gotten to a place where I think that, co-op is what I want to do. What does that mean to kind of set that up and get all that legalese structured? And then what does that mean to actually run Better to Speak as a cooperative? So I think what I'm talking about as far as the relationship building, community building, all those things kind of follow with that longer term goal of turning Better to Speak into a cooperative. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. As far as how people can get involved, because I'm also trying to be better at, I don't say asking for support, but just like people don't necessarily know what it is or what ways to get involved. So I'm trying to be better about articulating that as well. So I would say the biggest thing, is there a biggest thing? So with content, I would say just pitching stories to write. That's my biggest goal, is trying to pay people to write for the platform and get, I don't want to say just like any and everybody, because I think also just as pitches have come in, like I have gotten a few where I'm like, okay, you know what I mean? Like you write, but are you really, like I talked about, there are people that are very aligned, but then I feel like there are people that are just, and there's nothing wrong with this, but it's not necessarily, it's just an alignment thing. People that are just trying to pitch anywhere and get anything kind of published, and that's not necessarily what I'm trying to accomplish with it. So I want to pay as many people as I can to write, but also like have it be aligned and be very specific as far as like I'll know it when I see it, right? So I can't really articulate it, but that speaks to speaking power into Black youth, speaking about your perspective, talking about our collective condition, things going on in the world, things like that in a very specific way. And like I said, I know it when I see it. So that's one way, is to pitch or submit an article. The podcast is more of a thing. I don't know. I think I'm trying to be more open to like people reaching out to me to be on the podcast. because I think the way that I've done it before is very much like I'll reach out to and invite people to be on it, but I'm kind of playing around with like, do I want to make that more of like a public open thing, or just kind of say, hey, like, if you have work going on that you would like to talk about or anything like that, because again, I don't want it to be like a shameless self-promo thing. Like, I want to highlight people that are doing good things, but not even just like politics or social justice or whatever, but like that are in very niche aspects of different industries with the goal of supporting Black youth or centering Black youth, you know what I mean, that kind of thing. So the podcast could be another way to get involved, but like I said, that's more of like I reach out to you type of thing. And I do have like a bunch of people in mind, so I'm like trying to figure out, is that like, do I record an interview and that's just on, a written article on the website, or is that a podcast episode? So I'm going back and forth with that with a lot of people, but there are people that I have in mind that I'm wanting to reach out to for this season. As far as the different campaigns, so State of the Young Black Advocate, and then also the Right to Read, which I didn't talk about, but essentially the book drive will be a longer term campaign around literacy and education. So with that, I would say donate, volunteer, just spread the word. So I'm hoping to have different resources for people to just like learn more. Okay, so like a CTA, I don't want to like do this spiel all the time, but learn more and take action. So essentially like toolkits online for social media content to spread the word, or just in general, like learn more about the issues that we're working on. Excuse me. So that could be another way to get involved. And then as far as like the third goal, internal capacity, I really only have the budget as of right now to pay for the content community manager. But again, I don't want to like stop other people from like helping me. And that's also one thing I'm trying to work on. It's not like if people want to help, because people have said to me that they would help out for free. So I'm not going to block my blessing. I'm not going to stop you. So I do have volunteer positions that will be opening up later on. I think I'm trying to be really specific about when I do bring other people in, like what are the specific things that I'm asking people to do, or what are the very specific things that I'm needing help with. So I'm trying to get a better understanding of like, what does that take to make BTS happen? Like I was saying, holistically, and not just, oh, I can focus on stories for right now, other stuff, while other stuff is kind of on a break or like in between stuff. But to make BTS run holistically, what specific things do I need help with? And so those will kind of be more reflected in volunteer roles as instead of like a general kind of thing. So that'll be coming soon. And then I guess overall, just like donate to support the work, because like I said, I have this grant, but I'm like nervous that I'm going to spend it all. So definitely donate. I think in terms of partnerships, that's another area. The way that I'm wanting to approach it, like I said, sometimes I'll reach out to people with very specific things in mind, but I'm also just opening myself up more to collaboration and co-creation of partnerships. So if you're a black young person, young adult who runs an organization, runs any type of project, or works somewhere that would be open to a partnership in that capacity, I'm open to like talking about what that might look like, and if it kind of aligns with what I'm trying to do, because I'm trying to stay very like focused on my goals, not necessarily taking on every single project under the sun for the sake of, but if it's not like the biggest lift in the world, but for the most part kind of staying within that scope of what my goals are for this year. So with that said, I'm definitely open to like talking to people and partnering and figuring out like how I can be of support, or vice versa. So that will be reflected like on the website. All this will be like kind of reflected on the website too, because I'm bad at explaining things in my head. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I'm excited for this year. I think just again based off of like the pitches that I've received and the people that have applied so far for the content and community manager role, I don't know, this year feels very different. And I think like I talked about in the podcast episode, taking that break was very necessary, because it gave me a lot of space to think about what is the big picture of all this, and like what am I working towards, and not just like keeping up with this hamster wheel of feeling like I need to be consistent but not necessarily know without knowing where I was actually going, what the actual end goal was. And so now I feel a little bit more aligned with that. But I feel even with that end goal more in mind, there's the process of it. I think, like, I don't want to be so rigid that I like block myself from different learning opportunities. And so I think I don't know, I'm just like open to see like where the process takes me, and where different partnerships and things like that take me, because I think it'll be a great learning experience. And I've always said with BTS, like, even if it isn't something that turns out to be like, I, you know, turn this into a whole organization that I'm making money from and that pays other people, you know, consistently for forever, it is something that I've learned a lot from. And I think it's definitely stuff that I could take to any job or even to like another business or anything like that. So I don't know, I'm excited. I think links and things will be in the description if this goes on YouTube or other platforms.